In Aetheria, the nights were usually alive with a gentle hum, a melody of distant stars and the soft rustle of leaves. But that night, the Tower of Whispers felt like a lonely island in a sea of heavy, gray silence. Inside the study, the fire was roaring in the hearth. Yet Elian noticed the shadows on the walls weren't dancing as they usually did. They seemed to be shivering from a chill that had no source. His master, Eldrin, stood by the stone balcony. His long silver beard caught a wind that didn't smell of pine or jasmine, but of dry, bitter ash. "Look closely, Elian," Eldrin murmured, his voice thick with a weariness that went deeper than age. He pointed toward the horizon where the silver-leaf forest lay. Usually, it glowed like a fallen galaxy, but tonight, a thick mist was swallowing the ivory trees. One by one. "The heart of the forest is tired, my boy. A cold shadow is coiling around its roots. If it stops beating, the magic of this world will simply fall into a sleep from which it may never wake." Eldrin turned and picked up the ether-light lantern. It was a simple crystal sphere, but as Elian took it, he felt a soft, violet pulse, a steady warmth that climbed up his arm and settled near his heart. "The elves are frightened," Eldrin said softly. "The forest has closed its paths to them. You are a star-bearer. Your light is the only thing this shadow cannot touch. You must go to the high city of Silveris. The fate of every leaf and every song now rests in your satchel." Elian packed only what he needed: a cloak, a small loaf of honey bread, and a vial of moon water. He looked at the crackling fire, the only home he had ever known, and felt a lump in his throat. But as he descended the spiral stone stairs, his footsteps echoing like a quiet heartbeat, he knew he wasn't just leaving a home. He was carrying its warmth into a world that was slowly growing cold, leaving the stone embrace of the tower. Elian began his descent into the valley. The path, once lined with whispering golden wheat that brushed against his knees, now felt narrow and cold. A heavy, unnatural fog had settled over the land, a damp veil that didn't just hide the world, but seemed to swallow the very idea of color. As he reached the ancient ivory archway that marked the entrance to the Silverleaf Forest, he stopped. The grand trees, which usually radiated a soft, celestial glow even in the deepest night, stood like pale ghosts in the gloom. He stepped over the threshold, and the ground felt different beneath his boots. The moss, normally springy and warm, was now flat and lifeless, like old velvet left out in the rain. The ether light in his hand reacted immediately. Its violet pulse grew stronger, as if the lantern itself were a lung. breathing in the shadows to keep Elian safe. Every few steps, he saw the gray rot, veins of charcoal-colored shadow climbing the ivory trunks like frozen lightning. He reached out to touch a leaf, and before his fingers could even graze it, the leaf crumbled into fine, silver ash. The silence here was heavy. He could no longer hear the distant rush of the river or the rhythmic chirping of the night crickets. There was only the sound of his own breath and the faint, crystalline hum of the lantern. The forest felt like a great cathedral where every candle had been snuffed out. Elian held the light higher, realizing he was no longer just walking a path. He was holding onto a flickering lifeline in a world that was being slowly forgotten. As Elian moved deeper into the heart of the silverleaf, the fog grew so thick that the massive ivory trees became nothing more than pale ghosts. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A rhythmic, melodic chiming, like glass bells brushing against one another. Elian froze. Holding his lantern high, the violet light caught something shimmering among the high roots of an ancient tree. From the mist, two tall figures emerged with a grace that made no sound upon the dead leaves. These were the Silver Wardens, the legendary protectors of the woods. Their armor wasn't made of heavy steel, but of starlight glass, a material that seemed to hold a piece of the winter sky within it. Every movement they made produced that ethereal chime, a song designed to calm the forest, even in its darkest hour. The warden on the left, an elf with eyes as clear as a frozen lake, lowered his long spear, not as a threat, but as a sign of respect. He saw the star symbol on Elian's cloak and the pulsing violet light of the lantern. "The tower has answered," he whispered, his voice resonating like a low chord on a harp. "Master Eldrin sent me," Elian replied, his own voice sounding small in the vast, cold woods. "The heart is failing, and I can feel the life being drained from the very soil." The warden nodded, a shadow of sorrow crossing his face. "It is the Shadow-Blight. It began at the roots, turning the sap to ink. The queen is holding the last of the light in the high city, but her strength is a fading candle. Stay close. Starbearer, the shadows here have grown hungry, and they no longer fear our spears, only the purity of the flame you carry." Together, they began to move through hidden paths of white stone, their steps a quiet prayer in a dying cathedral. The path of silver stone began to incline sharply, winding upward around the massive girth of the mother trees. Titans, so ancient that their lowest branches were hidden above the cloud line. Guided by the two silver wardens, Elian felt the air grow thinner and colder, yet strangely more vibrant. The gray mist of the Shadow-Blight struggled to climb this high. But even here, the strain was visible. The legendary bioluminescence of the high city, which usually painted the sky in shades of neon teal and soft gold, was flickering like a dying candle in a drafty hallway. As they crossed a bridge made of woven starlight and living vines, the city of Silveris finally revealed itself. It was a masterpiece of organic architecture, where dwellings were shaped from the living wood of the trees, connected by spiraling stairs and crystalline walkways that hummed with a low, melodic vibration. Usually, the city would be filled with the laughter of the elven folk and the songs of the night birds. But tonight, a heavy, velvet-like silence hung over the spires. The windows of the palace, once bright with eternal flame, were now dim, casting long, mournful shadows across the ivory balconies. They reached the great hall of the palace, a dome of transparent quartz that looked out over the entire forest. At the far end, seated upon a throne grown from white rose briars, was Queen Valeriana. Her beauty was timeless, yet her face was pale, and her silver hair seemed to have lost its luster, looking more like winter mist than moonlight. She spoke, and her voice sounded like a dozen distant harps, playing in perfect unison. Elian approached, the ether light in his hand pulsing in recognition of the Queen's ancient magic. The tower has sent its youngest spark to our darkest hour, she said softly. I can feel the light within your lantern. It is hungry to heal, yet it lacks the essence to reach the heart's deepest roots. The Shadow-Blight is not a disease, Elian. It is a void that drinks the world. To break it, you must find the sprites in the hidden glade. Only their essence, mixed with your flame, can wash the ink from the world's soul. Descending from the celestial heights of Silveris felt like falling slowly into a sea of cold ink. As Elian left the shimmering walkways of the high city behind, the air lost its starlight purity. It became heavy, smelling of damp earth and something sharper, the metallic, biting scent of the Shadow-Blight. He was entering the whispering thickets, a place where the trees grew so close together that their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers, locking out the sky. Beneath his boots, the ground was a treacherous carpet of twisted roots and gray, brittle ferns. They didn't crunch like autumn leaves. They snapped with a sound like breaking bone. The ether light in his hand felt warmer now, glowing with the fragment of life force Queen Valeriana had breathed into it. It created a golden violet bubble around him, a small sanctuary of light pushing against a fog that seemed almost alive, swirling in patterns that felt intentional, even predatory. Then, the voices began. They weren't screams, which would have been easier to ignore. They were soft, overlapping whispers that sounded like the rustle of dead leaves against a window. "Turn back, Starbearer," the shadows sighed into his ear. "The light is a burden. Join the silence. The heart has already forgotten the sun." Elian felt his heart hammer against his ribs. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the lantern's handle. He remembered Master Eldrin's voice. "The mind is the first gate the shadow tries to break." To drown out the deceptive murmurs, Elian began to hum a low, simple hearth song he had learned as a child in the tower. His voice was a bit shaky at first, but it acted as a shield, vibrating through the cold air and reinforcing the lantern's glow. Blackened, thorny vines moved with a slow, serpentine deliberateness, reaching for the hem of his cloak, but they recoiled whenever they touched his radiance. Shriveling back into the murk, he saw small, frozen shapes along the path. Forest mice and songbirds turned to silver ash, caught forever in a moment of terror. Elian didn't run. He kept a rhythmic, steady pace, focusing on the fragrance of the light until the dense walls of thorns finally began to thin, and the sharp smell of rot was replaced by something electric and pure. As Elian pushed through the final, jagged barrier of the whispering thickets, the oppressive gray fog shattered like glass hitting a stone floor. He stepped into a realm where the laws of the outside world seemed to be suspended in a state of eternal grace. This was the hidden glade, the last sanctuary of the sprites. Here, the air was vibrant and alive, tasting of wild mint and the electric freshness that follows a summer storm. The sky above, visible through the natural dome of emerald leaves, was a deep, swirling indigo, filled with stars that seemed twice as large and 10 times as bright as any Elian had ever seen. At the center of the glade lay the Perry Pool. It was not a lake of ordinary water, but a basin of liquid starlight that rippled with colors that had no names. The water hummed, a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in Elian's very bones, washing away the fatigue of his journey and the bone-deep chill of the Shadow-Blight. Around the pool, flowers with petals of translucent glass leaned toward the glow, their centers pulsing with a soft, amber light, while giant mushrooms with caps like blue velvet provided a rhythmic, peaceful radiance. "Welcome, Starbearer," a voice chirped, sounding like a handful of silver coins falling onto a crystal plate. From the heart of a great orchid, the sprites emerged. They were tiny, flickering beings of pure energy, their wings moving so fast they were nothing but a blur of iridescent light. They circled Elian, their laughter a chorus of wind bells that harmonized perfectly with the humming pool. Elian knelt by the edge of the water, the ground beneath him feeling like warm silk. He watched as the sprites began their ritual, diving into the luminous water and emerging with droplets that clung to their hands like glowing pearls. These droplets floated toward his lantern. As he opened the silver cage, the liquid starlight merged with the violet flame, creating a brilliant, swirling vortex of gold and amethyst energy. It was a warmth that felt like a mother's embrace. "The essence is yours," the eldest sprite whispered, her touch like a gentle spark on his shoulder. "But the void is now hungry, and it knows you carry its ending. Rest for a heartbeat, for the return will require every spark of courage you possess." The warmth of the hidden glade lingered on Elian's skin like a gentle memory, but the moment he stepped past the emerald boundary, the air turned sharp and jagged. Within his lantern, the essence of restoration had transformed the violet flame into a swirling, molten gold that pulsed like a trapped star. It was beautiful, but it was also a heavy burden. In a forest drowned in gray rot, this purity was a scream in a silent room, an invitation to every hungry shadow lurking in the murk. As he retraced his steps through the ravine, the forest was no longer holding its breath. It was growling. A low, guttural thrumming vibrated through the soles of his boots, making his teeth ache. The shadows were no longer just drifting mists. They had begun to take solid, oily forms that coiled around the ivory trunks like starving snakes. Their eyes, faint flickers of sickly gray light, followed his every move. They didn't strike with claws, but with a coldness so intense, it felt like needles of ice piercing his cloak. Elian felt the familiar grip of panic tightening in his chest, his breath coming in ragged puffs of white steam. But then he remembered the queen's fading face and the way the sprites had trusted him with their last hope. He slowed his pace, deliberately finding a steady, rhythmic stride. He knew that fear was the very thing the Shadow-Blight wanted to drink. He focused his gaze on the golden vortex inside the glass. "Focus on the dawn," he whispered to himself, his voice a small but defiant spark. As a shadow tendril lunged toward the light, the ether light reacted with a sudden, brilliant flare. Each time the darkness touched the golden radiance, it didn't just vanish. It dissolved with a sound like a soft, weary sigh, turning into harmless silver steam that smelled of cedar and spring rain. He began to recite the litany of the stars, a chant he had practiced 1,000 times in the safety of the tower. Back then, it was just words on parchment. But here, it was a weapon. His voice grew stronger, harmonizing with the crystalline hum of the lantern. The forest seemed to scream in a language of snapping branches, but Elian remained the calm center of a golden storm, carving a tunnel of safety through the suffocating gray, until the distant, amber lights of Silveris began to glimmer through the canopy. As Elian climbed the final crystalline stairs back into the high city, the Silver Wardens didn't greet him with the usual cold precision of soldiers. Instead, they stood in a silent, reverent line, bowing their heads as the golden radiance of his lantern washed over their starlight armor. The light was so intense now that it pierced through the heavy cloud sea above the forest, turning the gray, suffocating fog into a shimmering field of amber. Inside the great hall of the palace, the change in Queen Valeriana was heart-stirring. The mere presence of the essence of restoration had revitalized the very air around her. She stood by the quartz dome, her silver hair no longer looking like winter mist, but glowing with a soft, lunar halo. "You have done what many thought was impossible, Starbearer," she said, her voice now possessing the clarity of a silver flute. "But the final trial lies not in the sky, nor on the surface. The heart of the forest dwells in the deep-root sanctuary, miles beneath the earth, where the first seed of Aetheria was planted at the dawn of time." She walked toward the center of the hall, where a circular mosaic of interconnected vines decorated the floor. With a gentle wave of her hand, the stones began to shift and rotate with a sound like grinding velvet. The mosaic opened to reveal a vertical shaft of pure white light, a pillar of energy that seemed to go down forever. "This is the vein of the world," she explained. "It is the path of pure life that leads to the core. You must descend, Elian, but be warned. As you approach the heart, the Shadow-Blight will be at its most desperate. It has nowhere else to hide." Before he stepped into the light, the queen placed a small silver charm in his hand, a leaf of eternal spring. It felt warm, and as Elian touched it, he caught a fleeting scent of sun-warmed hay and distant rain. "If the darkness becomes too heavy to breathe," she whispered, "hold this close. It carries the memory of every sunrise this forest has ever seen." Elian secured the charm to his belt, took a final deep breath of the high, sweet air, and stepped into the shaft. He didn't fall. He felt himself being carried by a warm, invisible current, drifting downward into the very soul of the world. The descent through the vein of the world felt like a long, warm dream. But as Elian reached the bottom, The golden safety of the light shaft began to fray. He stepped out onto a platform of ancient, fossilized amber, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Before him lay the heart of the forest, a crystalline root the size of a cathedral, suspended in a cavern so vast and so dark that it felt like the space between the stars. But the heart was not glowing. It was being strangled. Thick, oily tendrils of the Shadow-Blight had wrapped around it like a web of blackened thorns, pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic gray that seemed to mock the world's natural beat. As Elian approached, the shadows did something far worse than claws. They coalesced into a mirror, a shifting, dark reflection of the forest itself, withered, silent, and dead. A voice, cold as an ice-covered grave, echoed directly inside his mind. "Why do you struggle, little spark?" The shadow sighed, sounding like a distorted version of his own voice. "The cycle is over. The light you carry is just a lie, told by those who are afraid to simply let go. Join the stillness. It is so much easier to sleep." Elian felt his knees weaken. The weight of the world's hope felt like a mountain on his shoulders. And for a heartbeat, the darkness felt almost welcoming. But then, his hand brushed against the leaf of eternal spring on his belt. A sudden, sharp warmth flooded his senses. The scent of sun-warmed hay, the memory of Eldrin's fireplace, the taste of honey bread. He looked at his lantern. The essence of restoration was swirling violently now. An impatient vortex of amethyst and gold. "The light is not a lie," Elian whispered, his voice cracking at first, but then growing steady. "It is the breath of the world." He didn't run. He took one rhythmic, defiant step at a time. The sovereign spark within the glass flared with such intensity that the cavern walls turned into mirrors of fire. The shadows shrieked, a sound like metal grinding against deep ice, and began to recoil as the combined power of the stars, the queen, and the sprites merged into a single, unstoppable sun. Elian reached the base of the heart, his hand trembling, not with fear, but with the raw, beautiful power he was about to unleash. At the foot of the choking heart, Elian stood as a solitary pillar of gold in a cathedral of shadow. With hands that no longer shook, he unlatched the silver cage of his lantern for the final time. The essence of restoration, now fully merged with the sovereign spark, didn't just drift out. It surged like a river of liquid sun and molten amethyst. As Elian pressed the lantern against the cold, blackened crystal of the heart, the world seemed to hold its breath for one heartbeat, and then the silence broke. The Shadow-Blight didn't just retreat, it vanished as if it had never existed. The thick, oily tendrils that had strangled the heart shriveled into white steam that smelled of crushed pine needles and the first rain of spring. Elian watched, breathless, as the great heart ignited from within. A brilliant emerald light, more vibrant than 1,000 forests, exploded through the cavern, turning the fossilized amber walls into a kaleidoscope of green and gold. He could feel the healing energy surging upward through the roots, traveling like warm lightning through the vein of the world. He knew that far above, in the high city of Silvaris, the gray soot was falling from the balconies like harmless snow. In the whispering thickets, the blackened thorns were blooming into silver lilies. Every tree in Aetheria was breathing again. Elian leaned his forehead against the now warm surface of the heart, his eyes closing in exhaustion. The biting cold of the void was gone, replaced by a gentle, pulsing warmth that felt like a long-lost embrace. The heavy silence was replaced by the song of the forest, a low, harmonious hum sung by the earth itself. The burden was gone. He was no longer a frightened apprentice carrying a flickering hope. He was the one who had brought the dawn. The heaviness in his limbs was no longer a burden of fear. It was the deep, earned rest of a protector who had finally saved this ancient realm. The first sun of the restored Aetheria didn't just rise, it bloomed. As Elian stepped out onto the high balcony of the Palace of Quartz, he found the world transformed. The gray, suffocating veil was gone, replaced by a sky of brilliant sapphire. Below him, the silverleaf forest breathed once more, its ivory leaves catching the morning light and reflecting it in 1,000 shimmering prisms. For the first time in what felt like an age, the air tasted of wild honey and ancient rain. Elian looked down at his hands. They were stained with the dust of the deep earth, yet they felt lighter than ever. The ether-light lantern hung at his belt, its crystal now clear, containing only a faint, contented hum, a quiet memory of the sun he had carried into the dark. He wasn't the same boy who had left the Tower of Whispers with a satchel of bread and a trembling heart. Queen Valeriana approached him, her footsteps, a soft melody on the stone. She no longer looked like a fading flower. Her presence was as radiant as the dawn itself. The forest remembers its savior, Elian, she said, handing him a simple, weathered map made of soft leather. But Aetheria is only one branch of the great world tree. To the north, Beyond the singing river, the Goblin Mountains have fallen into an unnatural silence. The stone singers have stopped their craft, and a different kind of shadow, one of iron and cold soot, is rising. Elian took the map, feeling the familiar stir of destiny in his chest. He looked back at the forest he had saved, then toward the jagged purple peaks on the horizon. His journey as a star-bearer had only just begun. With a final nod to the Queen and a heart full of newfound courage, he adjusted his cloak and began his descent. He wasn't just walking away from a victory. He was walking toward a new dawn,